Hello all, welcome to my AFAS 160 Intellectual AV Mix project. So my project will be about racism in college campuses, um, contemporarily in the past, because as we know, it is still going on, and in some cases, it is still flourishing on college campuses, even 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So the first audio clip I'd like to present to you was taken from the Higher Education Anti-Racism podcast featuring Robert Goodrich. Um, so Goodrich himself is deeply involved in the idea of breaking down barriers, being a co-founder of Racial Advocates for Cross-Cultural Education, which is basically an organization specializing in creating competent cultural education programs for youth, college campuses, high schools, you name it. So in the clip, Goodrich discusses the racial divide in schools and how we should have a dialogue about it and present it.
Robbie, in thinking about how you might define dialogue or the power that you believe dialogue can have, do you mind sharing some insight?
Thank you, Dr. Q, and thanks for the question. I first want to hold up this ever-present idea that that is seated inside my soul at this point in my life, is that everything that we do, especially in education, is held up against these white cultural norms, especially communication styles, and that the primary feature of cultural norm, this white cultural norm, is a binary: the person that has the information and the person that needs it, and that how that language, in particularly spoken or written word, are the only ways to transmit dialogue. And what I hesitate to sort of to seat this conversation is that that's the only way that we can have dialogue. There are cultural expressions of power that come in the form of art from our ancestors that are non-traditional, that often get ignored, and is one of the primary concerns and problems with the way that pedagogy or epistemology in America is supported and brought into the dominant culture here in America. So yes, I do believe in the same ways that Dr. Q does about that dialogue. It has to be an exchange, but that it just can't be an exchange equally. It has to be equitably. That means that whether it's an individual or a large group of people, or if it's just two people, there has to be an openness, not only to the words that are being transmitted, but the identity of those folks and the history of that person.
So as Dr. Goodrich eloquently said, better than really I ever could, the issue of the problem of racism is not that it's not being brought up in schools, because it definitely is. As we know, there's been protests, teachers, professors talking about it, everybody talks about it. But the primary crux of the issue is that white cultural norms prevent us uh, from having an equitable dialogue of the subject. Um, so, as it's been said time and time again by prolific writers in the Harlem Renaissance, such as Langston Hughes, obviously he's spoken about it a lot, whether that be through his poems, books, you name it, just general sayings. Um, the black experience is difficult to put into words. It must be lived, it must be experienced yourself. So an equitable dialogue about it is difficult. Um, but if their history, their culture, and emotion are taken into account, then it is possible. So the next form of media I would like to show is a segment on racial protests brought to you by GMA, also known as Good Morning America. So students at college campuses such as Clemson and TCU are uncomfortable with politicians and racial divide at their schools, obviously. So at Clemson specifically, a statue was erected a long, long time ago of former Vice President John Calhoun, who prior to the Civil War supported slavery. So basically, a bunch of students got together, including two former Clemson Clemson graduates who are now in the NFL, Deshaun Watson, and all of them signed a petition. The statue was taken down, but there was a massive upcry about it. And so that's what kind of this segment is about.
Or institutions like to say everybody had equal access to it, but it's named for a person who said that slavery is a positive good.
The Board of Trustees at Clemson University stripping John Calhoun's name from its honors college after NFL stars Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins, who went to the school, joined over 20,000 others to sign a petition demanding it be renamed. Calhoun, the former vice president, was a staunch supporter of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War, and Clemson's campus was built on his plantation.
People ask questions like, when do we stop taking the names off of buildings at universities? And my response to that, of course, is when there aren't any that are named for slaveholders.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
Others stepping up and calling for change at Texas University as well. A group of nearly 40 student athletes have written a letter calling for sweeping changes, including renaming several buildings on campus and replacing the school song, The Eyes of Texas. A song that was once performed by white performers singing in blackface. At Liberty University in Virginia, basketball star Asia Todd says ongoing racial insensities have led her to transfer.
It simply does not align with my moral compass or personal conviction.
Her announcement coming after the president of the Christian University, Jerry Falwell, in a since deleted tweet, called out Virginia's governor to make a political point.
And this is a sometimes uncomfortable conversation that so many people are having across the country right now.
Uncomfortable, but as you said, very, very important.
So as you can see, consistent racial insensitivity at colleges such as Clemson and TCU have caused a lot of students to grow uncomfortable, drop out, go to the professors talking about the uncomfortability. So all this kind of reminded me of the 1960s, because in the 1960s, students were still doing this, specifically during the Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King. So during this period, African Americans would say, and I quote, they demanded programs to address the political and social climate in America, which obviously has not really been met. There has not been too much action taken to actually do that. So a lot of African Americans on college campuses are taking their own charge to do it, such as the actions against the statue of John Calhoun, who obviously was a former slave owner. He supported slavery. So it just kind of goes to show how fed up a community of people is getting after so long of oppression on college campuses. So the next audio clip I'd like to present is in our segment from the Heart Podcast, and it features Dr. David G. Embrick. So Dr. Embrick is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut. And essentially in this podcast, he discusses the significance of dialogue in institutions such as universities, the government, and more. He believes that some of these institutions, rather than be reformed, via the professors or administration or whatever, he believes they may need to be dismantled in the process because of the structural racism that is deeply rooted. So basically the qualifications he has to be talking about something like this is he's a professor of sociology and African studies, which means he knows what he's talking about. He can also kind of view the situation from the first hand.
And those changes that we can talk about, real changes are going to have to be conversations about, either we're going to talk about dismantling the institution, right, which is one way to do it, right, because it's deeply rooted, or we're going to have to talk about real structural changes that get at some of these roots, which is a combination of a bunch of things that include real curriculum changes, right, that allows people to understand and read about the histories of people of color, that they have contributed to the sciences and the social sciences, that they've contributed to the foundation of the universities, that they have donated money to the university, that they have, they have been instrumental in a lot of ways that we have minimized, marginalized, and erased. Right. That's one of dozens and dozens of things that we need to do collectively in order to sort of move the university forward. Right. And so that's what happens when you start to think about institutional racism, as opposed to sort of these bandage approaches that a lot of universities have done, right? Let's create an ombudsperson office. That's great, right? Because we need to have a place where people can air grievances, so they can air grievances so we can get at individuals. Well, no, right? Individuals come and go, right? Students come and go, faculty come and go. The institution pretty much stays the same. And most institutions are highly vested in the status quo. That status quo is based on sort of white supremacist normativity.
So as we can see, Dr. Embrick kind of is an expert on all things Africana studies. He offers a valuable perspective, given the fact that he works at the University of Connecticut. He can speak firsthand to everything going on, the structural racism occurring inside the university, what measures actually work in terms of mitigating racism on the university campus. So I thought he was a very valuable resource in that regard. So he speaks to protests, he speaks to the destructive nature of false curriculum, false teaching. He speaks to the inherent and structural racism inside these universities, which, as he said, might need to be dismantled. Because it's so deeply ingrained in the university that, you can add an office of racial affairs, and that offers a very valuable place to air out your grievances. But as he said, that's not always going to be super beneficial. It's not always going to work. Some things you need, a complete change in the foundation. So he does offer a hopeful message on the situation, saying that there can be change if dialogue is had, if curriculum is changed, if these structural changes are replaced. I would say that kind of reminds me of Maya Angelou and her poem Still I Rise, which obviously we went over in class. In fact, I did my author discussion primarily on Still I Rise. In Still I Rise, she talks about people hearing her voice. Still I rise from, everything being brought down upon her, people trying to silence her voice, people trying to shut her up, and she airs it out. And so what Dr. Embrick kind of said reminded me of that. So I thought it was a great segment from the podcast and a kind of great tie into the subject. So this next video comes to us from Penn State Live, which is essentially the university's broadcasting network on YouTube. So the video shows Kiva Spence, a student member of the Black Caucus, discussing racism on the campus. She makes very impactful statements during the video, such as discussing the student body as a they rather than a we. So the only situation she says where it's actually we on campus is when it comes to sporting events and stuff of the like.
I hope they see that this is an institutional problem. This goes on at many campuses. This needs to be stopped. It's not like you can't ignore racism. You can't just walk away from it because it's still going to exist. Penn State has this thing with unity. We are, but we're never we are. We won't be we are. We're only we are when it comes to football or like games and like sporting events. But once we leave those fields, we split up again. So I feel like Penn State really needs, if we want to promote that we are and put it on our transcripts and every time to promote students to come here, we need to follow up with that. We need to have that we are, we need to have that unity. All the brothers and sisters. All the brothers and sisters. Must come together. Must come together. All the brothers and sisters everywhere. All the brothers and sisters everywhere. Must feel that time in the air. Must feel that time in the air. Common blood flows. Common blood flows. Common veins. Through common veins. Common eyes. And common eyes. All see the same. Now. 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 More than ever. More than ever. All the brothers and sisters. All the brothers and sisters. Must come together. Must come together. Ashe. Ashe. Ashe.
So that student, Kiva Spence, is among many African Americans speaking out against racial injustice on university campuses. She and her fellow members think that they are making a difference on campus, and hopefully it has a resounding impact across the whole of the United States. Overall, it is difficult to overstate just how bad the issue is of racism on college campuses. And while we have learned that dismantling the structures of these campuses may work, it is not for certain. The issue is so deeply rooted, not just in the institutions, but in the minds of those who attend the universities. All we can do is hope that change occurs in the near future. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.